They needed numbers to feel brave, to weaponize whispers into thunder, to disguise insecurity as alliance. You didn't realize it at first. You thought you were the problem. You overanalyzed every word, tried harder, softened more, made yourself smaller just to fit into spaces that secretly resented your presence. They fed each other lies about you because none of them had the courage to face what you reflected back at them, their own cowardice. But you weren't built to break under collective pressure. You were built to observe, to listen, to survive without needing retaliation. And when you didn't fold like they planned, when you didn't beg or perform or fall apart on cue, they misread it as weakness. But what they were watching was calculation. They underestimated the silent ones, the ones who don't seek revenge, but become it. You didn't shout. You didn't expose. You didn't try to convince anyone of your side. That's what made your response lethal. Because you didn't need a crowd, you needed clarity. And with that clarity, you stepped out of the game completely. Left them playing chess against themselves, each move exposing how shallow their alliances were. They built a house of mirrors to trap your image, but forgot that reflections don't fight back. They reveal. And now, one by one, they're realizing that unity built on resentment can't stand. That a circle for good and gossip is a ticking clock. That while they were celebrating your silence as defeat, you were simply watching, documenting, and outlasting. People always show you who they are when they think you have no power. That's the trick. And they showed you everything, their fear, their envy, their need to control what they can't become. But instead of reacting, you adapted. You cut ties without theatrics. You learned to smile in rooms where your name was being dissected. That was your edge. You didn't need to defend. You let your composure be the contradiction. And that composure, that became unbearable. Because billies don't know what to do when the target doesn't panic, when the person they try to erase starts glowing instead. So now they're unraveling, slowly, separately, because you were never the common enemy. You were the common mirror, and mirrors don't lie. The ones who threw dirt at your name are now buried beneath the weight of their own insecurity. Not because you exposed them, but because life did. See, you didn't have to play dirty. All you had to do was heal, improve, stay focused. And your growth became the loudest response they couldn't ignore. While they bonded over tearing you down, you built something they couldn't reach. Peace, discipline, direction. They watched, pretending not to. But deep down, they felt it. Your absence became the echo in every room. Your progress became the shadow following their decline. One by one, they're facing the fallout. Not because you fought, but because you didn't. You outlasted the game by refusing to play. What they didn't count on was your endurance. They mistook your silence for surrender. But silence, when intentional, is a strategy. A slow, patient burn that exposes the fault lines in every false alliance. And now, those fault lines are cracking. One by one, the bonds they built are dissolving under pressure. Because there was never real trust. Only shared insecurity, and once it turns inward, becomes cannibalistic. You're not watching them fall with joy. You're watching with clarity. Because you've learned something powerful. The people who try to break you with numbers are always the first to break each other. And you're still standing, still rising, still untouched. You didn't need to clap back. You just need to keep becoming. Every boundary you set, every goal you achieved, every moment you chose solitude over chaos. It was a strike they couldn't block. They rallied against you because they were threatened by the parts of you that didn't need approval. That's what they were really fighting. Not your mistakes, but your potential. They saw something in you they couldn't find in themselves. Conviction. And conviction doesn't need an audience. It needs purpose. And you found yours, relentlessly. And now that you've moved beyond their reach, they're left grappling with the truth you never fought them. You outgrew them. It's always a pattern. First, they isolate you. Then they imitate you. Eventually, they implode. You've seen it too many times to be surprised. They think they're in control until the weight of their own mask becomes unbearable. And that's where they are now, collapsing under the illusion of superiority they tried to maintain. Their narratives don't hold up anymore. The stories they told to justify their behavior are starting to sound hollow. Because people evolve. People watch. And now those who once believed their version of events are starting to ask questions. Why did they need so many to tear down one? Why is the one they dismissed the only one still walking with peace? Your strength came from knowing the difference between power and control. They tried to control perception. You built power from presence. They curated stories. You cultivated growth. And now, even the people who once doubted you are seeing the difference. Because power is magnetic when it's real. When it doesn't seek approval. When it doesn't need a campaign. You walk into rooms now, and they feel it before you speak. That unsettling calm. That unwavering eye contact. That stillness born of having nothing left to prove. You had the character, And character wins every time, especially when the crowd starts asking, "Where are they now?" They laugh together, conspired in circles where your absence was the entertainment. But now their laughter sounds strained. Their alliances are tense, because guilt corrodes fake unity faster than time ever could. They're afraid to speak freely around each other, afraid someone might switch sides or worse, start telling the truth. That's the danger of ganging up on someone who doesn't fight back and the guilt never leaves. And when one of them starts falling, the rest start wondering who's next. That fear, that's the consequence of playing games with someone who chose healing over revenge. Because you can't outrun the truth forever. Eventually it knocks. And it's never kind. What broke them wasn't your comeback. It was your refusal to engage. They expected you to seek justice, to beg for redemption, to try to fix what they broke. But you didn't. You left it behind. All of it in that absence. That was the final blow. Because it made them irrelevant to your next chapter. They didn't just lose your trust. They lost access to your story. And now they watch from the sidelines, desperate to know what happens next. But this time you don't owe them a single line. Not a word. Not a glance. You gained up on no one. You simply outlasted the collapse they swore would be yours. They expected a protest, not that they were ready for noise, for drama, for you to beg, argue, plead for them to see you clearly. That was the playbook they prepared for, because people who depend on power games always anticipate a performance. They wait for your resistance so they can label it instability. But you didn't give them one. You pivoted. Clean, controlled, wordless. And that pivot, it was the sentence they couldn't interrupt. They were ready for battle. You handed them absence. They expect you to scream in defense. You smiled and redirected your life without asking for permission. That's what dismantled them. Not an outburst, but the fact that you rewrote the dynamic without ever raising your voice. You walked away from the script they handed you. They gave you a role like the grateful one, the reactive one, the emotional liability. But you shredded it. You stopped memorizing lines that made you smaller. You stopped explaining your presence in rooms you helped build. That pivot wasn't an exit. It was an evolution. A decision to no longer play characters in someone else's narrative. And they didn't have a contingency for that. They knew how to handle rebellion. But evolution, that doesn't scream. It outgrows. They didn't lose control because you attacked. They lost it because you simply lost interest in being controlled. Every system is built on prediction. They counted on yours. They knew your weaknesses. Knew how you responded to guilt, to exclusion, to silence. They placed the pieces in perfect alignment, expecting you to play your part. But you didn't react. You rerouted. You pivoted with precision and zero explanation. That move wasn't out of character. It was the revelation of who you truly were. Beneath the people-pleasing, beneath the confusion, beneath the conditioning. And once you made that turn, the game dissolved. Because the game only works if you stay on the board. But you lifted your own hand and moved yourself off it entirely. They were prepared for resistance. But what they got was release. They studied your patterns. They memorized your empathy, your loyalty, your ability to keep trying even after it hurt. So when they pushed, they expected more of the same. They expected you to bend further, to offer another round of self-sacrifice, as if it were your duty. But you didn't bend this time. You bowed out, quietly, powerfully. You pivoted not because you were tired, but because you were finally awake. And people who wake up mid-pattern terrify those who live off predictability. You didn't fight them. You starved the script. You no longer made yourself available for manipulation that wore the mask of concern. It's a strange thing, how silence can carry more weight than any speech. They assumed silence meant defeat. But your silence wasn't empty. It was full of decisions. It was the sound of strategy, of boundaries locking into place. They expected a protest, a loud declaration of hurt, of betrayal, of injustice. But you had already said everything worth saying. They just hadn't listened. So instead of repeating yourself, you pivoted. And that pivot didn't need to be understood. It needed to be honored. They didn't. And now they wonder where the control went, where the closeness vanished. But you're not angry. You're focused on what's yours, on what no longer needs defending. You mastered something they never taught you: graceful exit, the ability to walk away without debris, without destroying what you built, but still refusing to live inside it. They were waiting for the explosion, the breakdown, the emotional unraveling. That's what they thought healing looked like: loud, chaotic, dramatic. But your healing was surgical. You extracted yourself like a surgeon removes a foreign object, carefully, deliberately, completely. And now they're left with a space they can't refill. Because it wasn't your presence that scared them, it was the way you left. Unbothered, unavailable, unreachable. You didn't just change locations. You changed frequencies. You became difficult to manage the moment you stopped needing to be understood. They expected you to stay in the room and explain why you were hurt, to overclarify your decisions, to give them the satisfaction of knowing they still had emotional pull. But you pivoted without the performance. And that's what stunned them. You didn't give them closure because closure is often a trap, a way to re-engage you in the very cycle you're trying to escape. You realize that not every exit needs an explanation. Sometimes the pivot itself is the statement, a statement that says, I'm no longer available for roles I didn't audition for. They were experts at drawing people back in with half fixes. A breadcrumb apology here, a vague compliment there. They didn't fear conflict. They feared finality, because once you pivoted, the door didn't swing. It closed, firmly, and not out of revenge, out of resolve. They weren't ready for that. For you to take your energy and redirect it into silence, into projects, into solitude, into people who don't require constant emotional translation. And now they don't know what to do with themselves, because people who rely on your reaction are nothing without it. You didn't take your power back. You simply remembered you never lost it. They had positions, influence, voices that filled rooms. They had one thing they couldn't buy, self-awareness. And once you pivoted into it, their power lost context. It looked big, but it wasn't stable. It looked loud, but it wasn't real. You saw through it, and instead of exposing it, you pivoted past it. That's the move they never expected. They paired for war. You gave them irrelevance. And now they watch, confused, as you build without asking, as you rise without needing, as you speak without shooting, because pivoting is power, the kind they never trained for. The moment you made peace with being misunderstood, you became untouchable. They don't know how to handle someone who no longer needs to correct the record. Someone who just leaves the courtroom and starts building the kingdom. They expected the protest, loud, public, emotional, but you pivoted. And in doing so, you didn't just exit the room. You became the room, one they no longer have the keys to enter. Let them knock, let them explain. Let them circle the door and wonder what happened. You owe them nothing, because the pivot is the answer. You weren't trying to win the game, you were dismantling it. And that's what shook them. Not your talent, not your presence, but your refusal to play by the rules they depended on to feel powerful. They created a system designed to favor performance over purpose, appearance over authenticity, manipulation over meaning. And while they thrived in that framework, you studied it. You stayed quiet long enough to see the levers. You traced the lies, observed how praise was rationed like currency, how silence was used to starve your self-esteem into compliance. But instead of trying to master their game, you walked away from the board. You weren't there to earn points. You were there to expose the illusion of the scoreboard itself. They kept moving pieces, waiting for you to counter. But you didn't respond with strategy. You responded with stillness. You didn't take their bait. You didn't argue for your place at a table you now realized was rigged. And in that pause, everything they feared took shape. Because the only thing more terrifying than someone who fights for inclusion is someone who realizes they never needed to be included at all. That shift wasn't tactical. It was spiritual. It was you stepping into a version of yourself that no longer accepted borrowed roles. You weren't built to compete with insecure people. You were built to collapse the arenas where they felt safe preying on the unaware. They called you unpredictable because they couldn't script your moves anymore. They were prepared for rebellion, not reconstruction. Your silence became threat. Your absence became evidence. Every time you didn't react, their story grew thinner. Their audience grew quieter. The applause they once earned by painting you as difficult no longer rang, because you had stopped being a character in their narrative. You weren't trying to be forgiven. You weren't trying to be liked. You were busy taking apart the stage where they once performed control, piece by piece, until it no longer held weight. What they didn't understand was this: when you stop needing to win, you become impossible to defeat, because defeat requires engagement. And you weren't engaging to prove anything. You weren't swinging for reputation. You were cutting the thread that tied your worth to their perception. Every time they pressed, you didn't flinch. You examined. You watched how their control required constant participation, so you stopped showing up, not in rage, but in realignment. And without your energy, their system started to cannibalize itself. They couldn't keep the illusion alive without a scapegoat. You were the light that made their shadow visible, and once you stepped out, it swallowed them whole. You knew the game had rules. Unspoken ones. Smile even when disrespected. Say thank you when overlooked. Be humble even when you're clearly being diminished. They all played by these codes, mistaking them for maturity. But you weren't interested in pretending anymore. You outgrew the silent suffering they called professionalism. You outgrew the deference they called humility. Your refusal to participate didn't come from ego. It came from truth. And truth never fits into systems built on convenience. That's what your presence threatened: the convenience of pretending everything was fair. You didn't ask for more. You stopped pretending less was acceptable. They weren't ready for someone who no longer wanted their approval. That's when their power began to collapse, because their entire framework relied on reward and punishment. Keep you chasing praise, fearing exclusion. But when you pivoted from needing recognition to offering self-respect, their structure failed to apply. You became untouchable not by force, but by detachment. Not apathetic, but clear. You knew exactly what the game costing your peace, your voice, your time, and you weren't willing to pay it anymore. You didn't rage against the system. You let it collapse under the weight of its own emptiness. They wanted you reactive. You became rooted. They needed you confused. You became concise. That transformation unraveled them. Because control doesn't work on clarity, and clarity was your greatest rebellion. Not clarity in action, but clarity in presence. You stopped justifying your path. You stopped shrinking your insights. You stopped translating your decisions into palatable terms. And they called it arrogance. But what they really meant was, we don't know how to manipulate this anymore. You weren't trying to checkmate anyone. You were done playing. And in leaving the game, you made the game look small. The fear you triggered wasn't about your rise. It was about your freedom. You were the proof that power could exist without performance. That value didn't require validation. And that terrified people whose entire self-worth was tied to maintaining superiority through illusion. They don't hate you. They hate you don't need them. Because nothing unnerves a system more than someone who doesn't believe in its metrics. You became dangerous not by shouting, but by walking away without losing your identity. You didn't sacrifice yourself to exit. You carried every part of your becoming with you. They had allies. You had a leverage. You had liberation. That's the difference. Their connections were built on convenience and gossip. Yours were earned through self-awareness and quiet conviction. They thought your pivot was avoidance. But avoidance is fear-based. Yours was calculated. A conscious choice to no longer barter with people who couldn't afford your peace. And when you left, you didn't just reject the game. You redefined the rules. You reminded everyone watching that you don't have to destroy something to disempower it. You just have to refuse to need it. You weren't trying to win. Who you were remembering. Who you were before the noise, before the labels, before the game taught you that survival required submission. And now you've returned. Not louder, not heavier, just sharper, lighter, and completely beyond reach. Because the people who built the game never expected someone would walk out with dignity intact, carrying the instructions under their arm, and never look back.